Welcome to the Better Together podcast, where we look at ways we can come together to help each other minister more effectively in the Lord's kingdom. Today we have Dr. Greg Ketteman with us. He's the Vice President for Strategic Initiatives and Graduate Dean at Welch College. He is the son of the first student to ever attend Welch College in 1942, Paul Ketteman. And he graduated a little bit after that himself in 1977 from Welch. He also has a master's in educational administration from Middle Tennessee State University, the Blue Raiders. And he's got a doctorate in educational administration from Tennessee State University. Are they the Tigers?
That's right.
The Tigers. And he worked for 30 years in the metro school system. He was a teacher, a coach, and a principal. And then in 2006, he came here to Welch College. And so, Dr. Ketteman, it's so good to have you here with us today. And you did some really important work as you were there working as a teacher and later as a principal in the administration there in the metro school system. And so we wanted to talk to you today a bit about how a teacher is really like a missionary. Mm-hmm. You guys train teachers to go into Christian schools and public schools here at Welch College, but you have the personal experience of being a teacher and an administrator later in the public school system in Metro, is it Davidson
County? Yes.
So tell us about how a teacher, how an administrator can be a missionary in that particular area.
When I graduated in 1977, the teacher ed program at the college was very new. Mm-hmm. The licensure with the state, Dr. Etta Patterson and I argue about whether I was in the first class or whether it was the class of 76 that was the first class licensed. But anyway, it was one of the first classes that was licensed in Tennessee. So we actually had the credential to teach in a public school. Mm. And some of us did. Some of us decided that that this was something that God wanted Christians to do. Mm-hmm. We hadn't been called as ministers, but we felt that we were called to, as we talk about a lot now, be salt and light.
Yes.
We didn't really express it so much that way that we would have agreed that that's what we were doing, but that we had a responsibility. We could see what was happening in the public schools with a lot of Christian families leaving the public schools, a lot of Christian teachers leaving the public schools. And so we felt that there was a mission field, so to speak, in the public schools at that time.
So we're talking back the 1970s, and some of our millennials and Generation Z may be listening and saying, oh, those were the good old days. Not so, were they?
No.
Coming off of Vietnam and the impact of the 1960s and so forth. So you could see secular humanism going into the schools at that point, and like you mentioned, and some would say Christian flight from public schools. So what were some ways you all were able to be salt and light in those particular situations?
Well, obviously, the first thing that was very important to us was to live and work with integrity, so that we would be people that sort of like Daniel served in a pagan bureaucracy, that we wanted to, we understood that the public schools weren't designed to necessarily, at least at that point, they had not, I don't know if I should say they weren't designed to be, because initially a lot of what happened in public schools in the United States had Christian purposes behind it. However, at that point, certainly, public schools weren't endorsing people coming in and talking a lot about the Lord and attempting to influence other people, attempting to make converts and win people to Christ. So, but we knew that the first thing would be that we lived lives of integrity, that what we did in the school, we did it with honesty, that we did it with honor, that we did everything as unto the Lord, as we're told in the Scripture. We also knew that it was going to call on us to do things with excellence. That in order to, it'd be one thing to be honest, but it's another thing to be really good at what you do and be an honest person. And I think, again, going back to Daniel's example, it was very clear that his bosses, so to speak, recognized that it said he had an excellent spirit.
Yes.
But it also said he was very skilled in what he did. And so he was recognized for that, and he was valued for that, even in that pagan land. And God used that for his glory. And so that was sort of what we it was a very clear it was a very clear thought that we had at that time, that's what we were doing.
So some of our younger people may not know that it was in this time period that prayer was removed from schools. And so in presidential elections, you would hear people say things like, we need to put prayer back in the schools. And you mentioned how schools in many ways began, every day. In many places, they'd have the Pledge of Allegiance. They would read Scripture and so forth. When you were coming along, they were making it clear, that's not what you're here for. You're not here to proselytize, they might have said. Right. And so what I hear you saying is, you go to Daniel 1, and the Scripture says that those guys were good at science. They were good at learning other languages. And you mentioned that passage there in Daniel 6 where he had a spirit of excellence.
Yes.
And so you all went in and tried to do your best to just do a really good job as a teacher or as an administrator. I was in Cheatham County this past weekend at a wonderful restaurant there. I won't get into that. But anyway, here comes a principal there at one of the Cheatham County schools who's a Welch graduate. And he went on to get his master's at Austin Peay. But just kind of looking around that room, you could see the influence of people that went through the programs you're talking about, and how they have an influence in different counties in this particular area and really throughout the country. And I was kind of struck how many of them have been teachers of the year, how many of them have gone on into being a principal.
Yes.
And so I guess, would you say that's because of that excellent spirit coming out?
I think that's part of it, and it's probably the leading feature that ought to be it ought to characterize Christian educators, is that excellent spirit. I would say that along with that, though, when you have that Christian worldview, when you understand what the Scripture says about who people are, they're made in God's image.
Yes.
And that what we do for the least of these is significant. And so I think as a Christian educator, part of that spirit is to have genuine compassion, to really see people for who they are, to see people as loved by God, and people that they're worthy of our service, they're worthy of our investment. And that Christians ought to get that better than anybody.
Yes, yes.
So as an excellent spirit, one of the things is that how we view other people, how we view our relationships with them, and how we view what we're doing as ministry to other people.
So today, people like to say Christians don't like this group, they don't like that. In a public school system especially, but really probably all school systems, you have lots of individuals with various disabilities, and all of the things we read about in the news, this lifestyle and that lifestyle is always present. And so I think I hear you saying is, as a Christian, you're looking at every person as made in the image of God, trying to really be like to them, let the love of Christ come out in what you're doing. And it sounds like you're saying that often differentiates a Christian maybe from someone that might just be well-meaning or becoming more concerned with the end-of-grade test and how this impacts my evaluation.
Yeah, there's more to it than just, people are not one-dimensional. There is an intellectual dimension to people, but there is a soul.
Yes.
There's an eternal soul that matters to God, that's been created by God.
Mm-hmm.
And so our ministry to people can't just be an intellectual ministry. It can't just be an academic ministry. There's more to it than that. And, the public schools, they have been able to shut out a lot of kinds of formal prayer.
Mm-hmm.
But they've never, as far as I know, prevented me from saying to a parent or to a student that I'm praying for you, that I think about you, that I'm concerned about the things that you're facing. I would like to see you succeed, and I'm asking that God will show you how to do that. And I've perhaps people have been very offended by that, but none of them ever told me that in a 30-year career.
Right.
None of my peers ever told me that, and no students ever told me. I never had a parent that objected to that. In fact, I had parents that I knew were not believers, but when they had difficult situations, they were glad for me to pray for them.
They wanted some prayer, didn't they?
That's right.
So it's a good way to be like Daniel, have a spirit of excellence and do things well. Good way. You really talk about how you all were like light. What are some ways that being in this particular situation, one is salt as well?
Well, I think there are times when we're called on to make really hard decisions. We're called on to do things in the way that is it's legal, it's proper. We're called on to have sound judgment and then deliver bad news sometimes to people. To do things that are part of our responsibility that are unpleasant. And I think the way that we do that, doing that with not with arrogance or haughtiness or in an unfeeling way, doing it with compassion, but yet doing what it is that we're expected to do by our employer. By the system, by the people that we work for. And inevitably, the leader is the guy that's left holding the bag. The leader is the one that has to make those difficult decisions. So it may be the teacher as the leader in that class that's making those decisions. It may be the administrator in that school that's making those decisions. They're difficult, and I think that is a way that we can be salt. That we're carrying out some of the things. God says that authorities and rulers are instituted by Him, and so in some measure we're carrying out some of what God intended to create order and things that happen in a orderly fashion in our culture. And so sometimes we're doing that. And by that, God, I think, uses us as salt. Other times, it may come down to us having personal relationships with parents or with peers or with students, and we may tell them some things that they had never thought about. They are not aware of. So many times, people they're not aware of what the Scripture says about different things. And when we have the appropriate opportunity, we should be willing to stand up and say, we believe this is right. And we don't believe God created us to do this, or we don't believe this is right as based on what we see in the Scripture. There are opportunities for us to say that, and we need to be ready to do that.
And so that's a good way. You've got excellence, you've got light, and a way of being salt. I think about also the story of Daniel. People often ask, well, where was Daniel when Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were told to bow down to this image? And people like you that's been in a secular environment sometimes think, well, he may have been sent on a trip. And that's one way that Christians are salt in these situations. Often people know we disagree with certain things, like inviting a certain speaker in or a particular policy. And I think personally, that's what was going on with Nebuchadnezzar. He knew Daniel wouldn't bow, and so he had him off in Ethiopia or somewhere else.
Maybe so.
We don't know. It's all conjecture.
Maybe he told him to stay in his room, and I wonder if Daniel wasn't praying for him when all that was happening.
He could have been, but that's somehow how they know we're going to disagree with something, and they don't want us around, when that's going to happen.
Well, as you develop relationships with your peers, with people that are in your organization, with families and so forth, you you have opportunities in the community. And sometimes you have to, you don't attend a function in the community.
And it
people
speaks
know
volumes.
People know why
Yes.
you didn't attend.
Yes.
Sometimes you can't do something because you have an obligation at your church. And people realize, well, this person has a heart, and they're invested in a local church, in a ministry to our community. Sometimes you're doing things with your church that other people become aware of, that you're involved in a ministry with your church, and they can hear about it, they learn about it.
Yes.
And sometimes you don't participate in things. Maybe you're at an event and there's alcohol at the event, or there are other things that are happening at the event, and you don't participate. You don't become a part of that. And you don't endorse it, and you don't participate.
Right. It's another way of being salt.
That's right. It's not easy. It's not easy because there's pressure. There will be peer pressure and pressure from the community for you to participate.
So this really is a way, if someone feels called to teach others, to help others, they don't feel like they're called into the ministry, this is a way a person could go in and to be really a missionary, be on mission.
Absolutely.
Serving the Lord. It's also maybe a good avenue for folks that are in full-time ministry or that are in the pastorate to be a bivocational pastor.
I totally agree with you, as you already know.
I know that,
Brother Eddie.
And I was at a funeral this past week, and I noticed a certain person, the Ketteman, sang at that funeral.
Yeah.
And I was looking at your bio. For 27 years, you've been a music director there at Cross Timbers Church. So in many ways, you've been bivocational as well.
That's true. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about how that has worked as you've been serving there at Cross Timbers, the same church, for 27 years, while having pretty big jobs, the job you have here now and then before at Metro School System. How has that kind of worked, complemented each other and so forth?
Yeah. Well, I think that from the church side, I thought of it as a way of making a contribution to my church. That I could serve in a role that our church could then invest in. Our church in particular, it was so our church could invest in a youth ministry.
I see.
And so rather than paying someone to do music ministry, I filled that role.
Right.
And so my way of looking at it was, okay, I can't give these extra dollars, but I can free up dollars in our church that can be used to hire someone part-time, and then later we did hire someone full-time to do youth ministry. So that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that I realized I had some gifts that God had given me, and that He was expecting me to invest those. And that was an opportunity for me to invest those gifts in my church, and so I did. The other thing that was surprising to me was how what happened in my community and my relationships with the schools was a way to really make those things real to my church.
Yes.
To the people that I was with, they knew something about the schools. They knew something about students. They knew something about people who worked in the schools. So that was a tremendous compliment, and I wish I had done more to integrate what I did with my community, with my work relations, and with my church. I wish I had done more of that. But it's a tremendous opportunity for people to see who you really are and to bring those things together and to let the church have a greater influence on the school and the culture. And then one last thing, you and I have talked about the fact that the state of Tennessee was actually helping out my church.
Yes.
And a person who's a bivocational minister, who perhaps a church can't afford to give them a large amount to go towards retirement.
Right.
But if they are vested in a retirement system like that, that's a burden that comes off of a local church. And it allows a minister to do what I was doing basically on a part-time basis, and yet a lot of the financial considerations, the health care insurance, those kinds of things are covered in another way.
Yes.
So, and they're tax funds that people in that church have contributed to. So it's sort of a more efficient way to make use of the taxes that people pay to help out the people in public service.
So as we go on, probably through time, it's going to be more and more difficult for churches to support people in full-time ministry. Yes. You've heard today how being a teacher, being an administrator, working in a school situation, even substituting, is a good way to be light and salt. It's a good way to model excellence, which people are attracted to. And then you're talking about if I was just working in the schools, you don't get a lot of opportunity to sing and to design worship services. So you were kind of scratching that itch as a bivocational person really ministering. But also, the church not having to pay you was able to hire someone else, able to send more resources outside.
Right.
And you alluded to, I noticed you've been a teacher for this amount of time as well at Cross Timbers. It probably impacts your teaching. It would probably impact someone's preaching. A lot of things that surprise people about what's happening in the culture probably don't surprise a lot of principals and teachers because they see it every day. And so in many ways, it helps equip us to be effective as we minister in our churches. So something really important to think about. Yeah. Well, Dr. Ketteman, thank you so much for stopping by today.
Thank you, Dr. Moody.
Sharing with us. We so appreciate your ministry, and we just wish you Godspeed and ask that you'll continue on.